למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.
Today's episode is about the Book of Jasher, or in Hebrew, Sepher Ha-Yashar. This is a lost book mentioned in two passages in the Bible. The first time is in Joshua 10:13, which describing the miracle of the sun standing still over Gibeon says, "Is it not written in the Book of Jasher?" Then when David is lamenting over Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1:18, it says, "Behold, it is written in the Book of Jasher." So what happened to this Book of Jasher? Jasher in Hebrew, Yashar, literally means straight. And Sepher Ha-Yashar is often translated as the Book of the Upright. And we have this book quoted twice in the Tanakh, but where is it? It's lost. Wouldn't you love to get your hands on that book? I know I sure would. And lo and behold, there is a Hebrew book published in Venice in 1625 that claims to be the Lost Book of Jasher. That's exciting. If this is legitimate, if this is a valid, authentic book, this may be the most important discovery, much more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls. An actual, authentic book from the time of Joshua. A source. It's actually used as a source in the Book of Joshua. Now, it was translated and published in English in 1840, and you can read it on the internet. But is this really the same Book of Jasher mentioned in Joshua and 2 Samuel? I decided to track down the world's foremost expert on the Book of Jasher. Here is my interview with Professor Joseph Dan. So you've continued in the footsteps of Professor Gershom Scholem, and you are actually, your official title is the Gershom Scholem Professor of Kabbalah at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
They gave me his chair.
Wow. Or the chair. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and your accomplishments are, like I said, you've written over 80 books. You're currently working on the definitive history of Jewish mysticism. And what is the title of that in English? You're on now volume 12, you told me?
It's History of Jewish Mysticism and Esotericism.
Which is like esoteric knowledge, secret knowledge. In Hebrew, Tolat Sod.
Actually, there is no term in Hebrew for mysticism.
Oh, that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Also, not in Arabic. No Arab and no Jew before the 20th century didn't know that he was a mystic.
That's amazing. So you're saying there's things in Jewish mysticism that aren't Kabbalah. So you can't call them Kabbalah, you call them Torat Sod, which is really the I guess, literally
esoteric knowledge.
Esoteric knowledge. Esotericism. Wow, that's very interesting. So mysticism is a foreign concept to Semitic languages, not just to Hebrew.
Sometimes misleading.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you're on volume 12 of the Definitive Guide to Jewish Mysticism. But today I actually wanted to talk to you about the Book of Jasher, which is in Hebrew called Sepher Ha-Yashar. And let me just kind of give a background for the audience why I wanted to talk to you about this. Why you in particular, Professor Dan. So for years, literally going back to 1998, when I first started a website on the internet, I started getting emails asking me by people who, they said there's this Book of Jasher, that's what they call it in English, Sepher Ha-Yashar in Hebrew. And is this a real ancient book, this Book of Jasher that's been translated into English? People ask me, is this the original mentioned in the book of Joshua and in 2 Samuel? And my answer always was no. And then people who were a little bit more bold would say, well, how do you know that? And my answer was always, well, this is what the scholars say. This is a scholarly consensus. When I started doing this Hebrew Voices series, one of the things I really wanted to do is get to the bottom of some of these questions. Because the real answer is when I would tell people it's not an ancient book, I didn't really know. I was just quoting what other scholars said. And I traced back those other scholars, and you, Professor Dan, are the source of what those scholars are saying. In other words, when any scholar today says, no, the Book of Yashar is not an ancient book, he's basing it on a study that you wrote in 1986. And so I wanted to talk to the man who is the source of this information, which is you, which is that the Book of Yashar is not an ancient book. And it's your thesis, and I'm actually holding here.
Just a moment.
Please, yes.
I'm not the first to say that it's not an ancient book.
So tell us the history of other scholars who said that before.
All the scholars who wrote the history of Midrashim, of Jewish legends and so on.
Midrashim are Jewish rabbinical legends.
Yeah, refer to Sepher Ha-Yashar, but they didn't really study the problem. And in most surveys before the time that I started, they say that this is medieval. Okay. Sometimes in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So what I succeeded to do, I hope, is to pinpoint the time, and it's a bit after the Middle Ages, early 16th century. But as far as I know, in Jewish culture, there was no one who really believed that Sepher Ha-Yashar is the book mentioned in Joshua.
Okay. So you're saying no, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's actually really interesting. So I'm holding in my hand this book that you published in 1986, and I want to tell a story to the people. So I wrote you an email, and then I called you up, and I came over here. And I said to you, I basically presented what I just presented. And I said, so how do we know Professor Dan? And you gave me, within about a period of about 20 minutes, you gave me 4 really solid points. And then you said to me, you said, this is great. Guys, this is classic. He said to me, Nehemia, let's not waste my time and let's not waste your time. He went to his bookshelf and he pulled off this 350-page book and he handed it to me. And he said, after you've read this, get back to me. So now I've read the book and I've really combed through it, and I have 12 pages of notes here, Professor Dan, of points, because I really went into this saying, okay, Professor Dan says it's a book from the Middle Ages. I don't know. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it is from the time of Joshua. Let the book speak for itself as I was reading it and looking at the evidence that you present. So one of the things that you, I want to read this. This is a quote from you from page 18 of your book. And the book is called Sepher Ha-Yashar in Hebrew, published in 1986. Joseph Dan is his name in Hebrew, Joseph Dan. And you wrote on page 18, you said, it seems that no one today would connect the Sepher Ha-Yashar mentioned in the Bible with this Sepher Ha-Yashar from the Middle Ages. You wrote that in 1986. And lo and behold, I'll just give you one example. You can go, by the way, onto Amazon Kindle, and you can find at least 10 editions of Sepher Ha-Yashar, the Book of Jasher, published in English, many of them claiming that this is an ancient book that goes back to biblical times. And I'll read you one example.
I didn't know that. It's a revelation.
Yeah.
If somebody unqualified would have told me that, I wouldn't have believed it. And it's most surprising.
And I'm not saying these are scholars, but these are people. For example, I was in Washington State a little over a year ago, and there's a new Bible put out in English, and it includes in it the Book of Jasher.
Wow.
And it claims this is an ancient book of from biblical times. And here's another example. A man named Ken Johnson, not to be confused with my friend Keith Johnson. Ken Johnson in 2008 put out a book called The Ancient Book of Jasher. And he says as follows. This is a quote. He says, it is approximately the same age as the biblical book of Genesis.
Unbelievable.
He says, we can know for a fact that the Mishnah and Talmud use this book of Jasher as a source document and not the other way around. Now, he doesn't say how he knows that. He just says it's a fact we know. And then he brings a quote from Josephus, which doesn't exist. He says Josephus says about it, and I looked it up. It doesn't exist in Josephus, unless he has some other version of Josephus. So what do you say about that, Professor Dan? You're the expert. You're the one who literally wrote the definitive study. And look at the beginning of your book. You have this definitive study that goes on for over 30 pages with all kinds of details that I don't think we're going to have time to get to today. But what do you say about somebody today who thinks this is the original book of Jasher mentioned in the book of Joshua and 2 Samuel?
Let me...
Please.
A paragraph of background.
Okay, please.
Something that I think people don't know, neither abroad nor here.
Yeah.
Jewish culture, throughout its history, until very modern times, completely neglected the concept of fiction. We don't have, except for a very brief period, in the 13th and early 14th centuries, we don't have the concept and the creativity connected with fiction. By fiction, I mean stories written by authors who know that they are not telling something which is truth, and readers who read it for pleasure or knowledge who know that this is not true, which is fiction, and it's part.
In other words, if I pick up a John Grisham novel, John Grisham knows he's not telling a true story, and I know he's not telling a true story. So you're saying that didn't exist in Jewish history up until relatively recently?
Same in, as far as I know, in Chinese, Japanese, Arabic, English, French.
Yeah.
All literature that I know of have this section of fiction.
Wow.
except Judaism, except for a few decades in the High Middle Ages.
Okay.
But the urge to write fiction is human. You will always have people who like to tell stories,
Yeah.
disregarding whether they reflect something true or not,
Yeah.
It's a human urge.
Yeah.
So the few people in Judaism who wrote narratives in prose had to disguise themselves, had to give some explanation. What am I writing? Why am I writing? I have to, perhaps you noticed that in the introduction, the later introduction to Sepher Ha-Yashar, the writer writes a series of to'alot, the usages of Sepher Ha-Yashar.
And to give the background, we'll go into this in more detail. There are two introductions to Sepher Ha-Yashar, and it's your contention the second introduction is actually the author's introduction. Although he claims it's not. He claims he didn't write the book, he found it. So there's 13
The first
toilot
introduction is of the printer.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's authentic.
Yeah.
It's what's written.
And he wrote that in 1625.
This printer has to apologize for doing that and finding ethical and ideological things in the book which explain why it should be printed.
Wait, why is he apologizing?
Everybody did. Everybody who wrote fiction, except in the very short period that I referred to, had to find some kind of apology. Because the concept of writing and reading fiction didn't exist.
Right.
People wanted to read the truth, or something ethical, something philosophical.
Wow, that's profound.
To read for pleasure.
Yeah.
To write for pleasure and read for pleasure, this concept is absent. So the author of Sepher Ha-Yashar, as far as I can diagnose him, is a person who is bursting with the wish to narrate, to tell stories. And he had to disguise it some way. I doubt it very much whether he himself for a moment took seriously his use of the Sepher Ha-Yashar.
In other words, he wasn't trying to scam people and deceive them.
Not really deceive, a kind of understanding.
This was his only creative outlet as an author to write fiction. And you actually mentioned to me when we met about a week ago, when you told me to go read the 350-page book, you said he likes to spin a yarn. He likes to tell stories. And I have a great example here. He tells this story. It's a complicated story of how when people would come before Pharaoh, there were these lions, and Moses and Aaron miraculously bedazzle these lions somehow. And here's this line from page 309 of the Hebrew edition of the book. And it says, V'gam hakfirim ba'u itam b'simcha, vayirdefu achareihem, vayismechu ka'asher yismach ha'kelev el adonav b'vo'o min hasadeh. And the lions came with Moses and Aaron joyfully, and chased after them with joy. And they were happy as a dog is happy when his master comes in from the field. This is beautiful prose. This is beautiful writing. And what you're saying is the guy liked to tell stories, and he didn't think anybody was going to think this is Sepher Ha-Yashar for the time of Joshua, is your contention. Wow, I mean, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? It's more beautiful in Hebrew. That's why I read it in Hebrew. And I'm a dog lover, so that's part of it. But what a beautiful image. The whole story of the lions is a great story, but they're coming like dogs. And it's interesting because I'm thinking of this guy. This guy didn't work in the fields. What does he know of the dog coming in? But he must have been sitting out, looking out his window, seeing the peasants in Italy coming in from the fields, and the dogs were out to them. And he writes that. It's beautiful. Now I want to give, we say in Hebrew, lasot seder, to kind of organize things. So there are two introductions. And the first introduction was written, we know, in 1625, or it was published in 1625, by the publisher in Venice, a man named Yosef HaKatan. His name is Joseph ben Samuel the Little. He was from Morocco. And he tells a story of how this book was copied in Morocco around the year 1613 by a man named Jacob ben Atiyah. And I'm taking this all from your book. Joseph the Little, he writes in his introduction, written in 1625 about what happened around 1613. He says, in the copying of this book, Jacob ben Atiyah copied it from a very old manuscript with unclear letters. And had it not been for the expertise of the aforementioned rabbi, meaning Jacob ben Atiyah, No one else could have understood those letters to copy it because of their age and lack of clarity. So that's in 1625. Now, in the second introduction, which is the earlier introduction, we don't know who wrote that second introduction. We don't have his name.
It's the author.
But you say it's the author. And we know for sure it was written in Naples about 100 years before 1625. That we know for sure. And how do we know that? So this is from page 38 of the book. And he tells the story of how he got this book, which you say is a fiction. And I think you're right. But he writes as follows. This is the second introduction. He says, "And it came to pass when the Lord exiled us a great exile at the hands of the king of Edom." And he certainly means the Christian kings when he says the kings of Edom. "From city to city and from nation to nation, in evil and bitterness, this book called Toldot Adam, the generations of Adam, reached his hands." And it's unclear who the his is. "Along with many books that came from that house in Seville, and they came to our city Naples under the rule of His Majesty the King of Spain." And you explain, based on the context of what he's talking about, this has to be the early 16th century in Naples, when it was ruled by a king of Spain, when Spain was united, Aragon and Castile. You go into the history there. So sometime in the early 16th century, the second introduction is written, and it's your contention that that was the original introduction of the actual author of the book, who was telling these fun stories.
And this introduction includes, I believe, you read it, with the same urge to spin a yarn, to tell a story, to be fantastic, to be intriguing.
So tell the fantastical story of how this book was discovered according to this, what you say is the original author.
Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to read it. So he writes this story, and you actually refer to this in the book as the Hasipur Yadua, the well-known story, and I actually didn't know this story. So I'm going to read it for the people. It's from page 37, and it's the story of Sidras and the old man. And this is describing an event that takes place during the sack of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed. And it says as follows, and again, this is from the second introduction written in the early 1500s by who, according to Professor Dan, is the original author. The 16th century, which is the early 1500s. Right.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Right.
So this is from the early 16th century, the 1500s, about 100 years before it was printed in Venice. And this is written in Naples. He says, "There was a certain general among Titus's generals named Sidras. He went in Jerusalem and found a very large house and took all the spoils that he found there. But when he wanted to leave the house, he looked at the wall. And he saw in his mind's eye," I love that in Hebrew, it's be'en sichlo. What does that even mean? He's clearly spinning a yarn, as you say. So Sidras saw in his mind's eye the appearance of a treasure in the wall. He then tore down the wall in the building and found one barrel full of many books, including the Bible, books of the kings of Israel, books of the kings of the nations, and other books of Israel. Also the books of the correct and proper Mishnah, which is ridiculous. The Mishnah was compiled in 210 AD under Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince. But in the sack of Jerusalem, Sidras found the original Mishnah. And he says, as well as many scrolls placed there. And it goes on to tell he found there an old man sitting and reading these books. And then it goes on and it tells how Sidras took this man along with all these books. And eventually they left Jerusalem and they wind up in Seville. And the books, these many books, are housed in Seville in Spain. And Seville was part of the Roman Empire at the time. So this is possible. It's not impossible. And then somehow, 1,400 years later, 1,350 years later, in the early 16th century, they leave Seville, these books, and end up in Naples in the hands of this man who's writing the introduction, who you say is the actual author, and he's making this up. He's spinning yarn, and it's a great yarn. I mean, this general, meaning he's writing something which sort of sounds plausible. And then he goes on to spin another yarn, which I do want you to tell the story of. And because I don't have the quote here, I want you to tell the story. He spins the yarn that this book even predates the destruction of the temple, that he ties it into the letter of Aristeas, which is the story of how the Septuagint was written. And he says this book played a role in how the Septuagint was written. So can you tell that story, Professor Dan?
I think that he tries to explain that the material in the Septuagint and the Christian Bible that is not found in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is taken from Sepher Ha-Yashar.
So he's explaining the Apocrypha. In other words, in the Apocrypha, you have all these stories that don't show up in the Hebrew Bible or only in the Greek. And the story basically he tells is the Jews didn't want to give the Bible to Ptolemy. This is a story around 250 BC. Ptolemy is making the library at Alexandria. It's told in the letter of Aristeas. And so he asked the Jews, he said, send us a book of your Torah and we'll have it translated into Greek. And the Jews were very disturbed by this. They didn't want the Bible translated into any language, certainly not Greek at the time. And according to this second introduction, written in Naples in the early 16th century, instead of sending him the Bible, they send him Sepher Ha-Yashar. And he translates Sepher Ha-Yashar into Greek, and then the Jews get caught.
And he is subtly making the point that the Christians actually don't know the real Bible.
Oh, because they have this Sepher
They
Ha-Yashar.
think that Sepher Ha-Yashar is the Bible.
That's pretty cool. That's very, very cool. All right. So I want to move on. So this guy publishes it in 1625, Joseph ben Samuel the Little. And there's this controversy around the publication of the original publication of the book. In other words, the man in Naples who writes the introduction, he intends to publish it, but he never does, as far as we can tell.
He says that he printed it in 50
copies. Yeah, and you made the comment.
We don't have any evidence. And nobody at that time or any time would print anything with 50 copies.
I mean, they would print a lot more. And it's strange, why 50? And you say in the book, you say, look, we don't ask questions about Jewish legends. People make stuff up in Jewish legends. And I mentioned to you before the interview that I wondered if he didn't take that from Christian history. There's the story that Constantine, shortly after the Council of Nicaea, ordered 50 copies of the Bible, or the Christian Bible in his case, to be created, to spread throughout the Roman Empire. I don't know, would a Jew in the 1500s know that story? Maybe. It's possible he got that number 50 from there. Now, you mentioned something really interesting in the book. You mentioned it almost in passing, that there's this scholar named Sunz. And Sunz is one of the founders of Jewish studies as a scholarly study in the 1800s. And he began to study Sepher Ha-Yashar because there were people in England saying in the English newspapers that the original book of Yashar, the book of Jasher mentioned in Joshua and in Samuel, was discovered. And Sunz, decided, look, I can't let this nonsense go without response. And he began to research it. And by the way, Jasher isn't someone's name. Jasher Yashar just means straight or upright. And it's interesting, in the second introduction, which you say is the introduction of the author, of the actual author, he interprets Sepher Ha-Yashar as the chronological book, meaning it's straightforward in its chronology, as opposed to the Torah, for example, which is not in chronological order always. It's sometimes by theme. The example is that Numbers chapter 9 is dated to before Numbers chapter 1. It actually gives a date in the book. And so this is in chronological order. This, some people call this pseudo-Jasher, this medieval Jasher. So I want to jump to this issue of Joseph ben Samuel publishing the book. And you write this in a little footnote that I almost missed. I missed it the first time I read it. And then I reread your study in 1986. And you mentioned that this book was censored. It was censored by the rabbis because they considered it a fraud, basically. And so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena was a polemicist, and he wrote many, many books. He was very integrated in Italian culture of the time.
And you mean Gentile, Christian Italian culture, right?
Yes, sure.
Even though he's a Jew, okay.
No, he was one of those kind of Renaissance people, Jewish people who really integrated in Italian culture. He wrote, what interested me most, he wrote a very detailed polemical work against the Kabbalah.
And you're the expert of Kabbalah, okay.
And he's the fierce opponent of the Zohar and the Kabbalah in general. He also he pretended to write a response to a book which I'm sure that he himself wrote against the Talmud.
What? Wait a minute. He wrote a book against the Talmud and then responded to that book.
Yeah. It's called Kol Tzachal V'Sha'agat Aryeh. Yeah, Kol Tzachal, the voice of the ignorant.
Fool. The voice of the fool and the roar of the lion.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that the voice of the ignorant is complete. It's just a very short book. And the roar of the lion is only the beginning of the book.
Okay.
And it was published anonymously. And I think his opposition to the Kabbalah is a part of his general reformist attitude. He wanted to modernize Judaism or so. And his book against the Kabbalah was published in 16 1648.
1648. Okay.
So
in the
that's
1600s.
before,
yeah.
and yeah.
17th century.
And I think he felt horror when he saw that the first edition of Sepher Ha-Yashar somehow claims to be the ancient biblical book. Not clearly, but yeah.
It alludes to.
So
Before we get to that, I want you to just say, as we say, standing on one leg, you are the world's foremost expert today on Kabbalah and hence on the Zohar. What exactly, for those who don't know, not exactly, in general, what is the Zohar? When was it really written and when did it claim to be written?
the Zohar was written, I just published volume 11 of the series, which deals only with the Zohar.
Which is the definitive history of Jewish mysticism, yeah.
No, it's the key, it's the most important. It was written by a scholar by the name Moshe de Leon, who lived in northern Spain in the last decades of the 13th century. Moshe de Leon.
Okay. Yeah.
And he died at 1305.
Okay.
And he wrote several Kabbalistic works in his own name.
Okay.
Yeah. And he wrote this enormous work, which is actually kind of a midrash on the Torah, homilies portion by portion on the Torah, which is the most important, meaningful, inspired work of Jewish mysticism or esotericism, you might say of Jewish spirituality.
Which is the Zohar.
Yeah, the Zohar.
So Moshe de
pinnacle.
Leon wrote the Zohar, you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. But he didn't write it in his own name.
Not on its own name, it's attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a Tanakh, a scholar of the Mishnah of the 2nd century, and his son and a group of friends around him and discussions and so on. And when I referred before to the absence of the concept of fiction, here we have an example.
Okay.
He wrote the narrative, a cover of the Zohar in the manner of a romance. A romance of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
And by romance, you don't mean romance like love. You mean what we say in Hebrew, roman, a novel.
Like the King Arthur and Alexander.
So a novel, basically, in modern terms.
A medieval kind of novel.
Okay. So basically, he wrote this in the 13th century, claiming it was written in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
1100 years earlier. All right. And there are people to this day who believe it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century.
In contradiction to the situation with Sepher Ha-Yashar.
Okay.
This is, in many circles, you are not really a good Jew if you don't believe that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wrote the Zohar.
Wow. So
it's a kind of thermometer.
Yeah.
You check how much Jew you are by this. And in fact, on the festival of Lag BaOmer, on the tomb of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the place they say is his tomb, near Safed, they say 300,000-400,000 people, Jews, assemble. Right. It's the greatest religious assembly of Jews ever.
Meaning it's the greatest annual, in fact, in Israel, it's my understanding, it's the greatest annual gathering of any kind, even more than the Muslims on their holidays on the Temple Mount. The largest gathering of anybody in Israel on an annual basis is the Jews at the tomb of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the purported author of the Zohar. I think it's the anniversary of his death, the 33rd day of the Omer.
No, it's connected to the story of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba against the Romans.
Okay. But they gather on the 33rd day of the counting of the 50 days towards Pentecost every year at the tomb of this rabbi who didn't write the Zohar, but he's given credit for it by this rabbi in the 13th century. Now, let's go back now to Sepher Ha-Yashar. So this rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena, he's writing in the year 1639, and he writes a book against the Zohar called Ari Nohem, the Roaring Lion, or something like the Roaring Lion.
1648.
Okay. In 1648, he writes this book And he goes on at length, apparently, about how the Zohar is from his perspective, a forgery, meaning it's not really written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
He was the first to write in detail the reasons why no one in his right mind will accept that the Zohar was written in ancient times.
So this is a book written in the 13th century, claiming to be from the 2nd century. And in the 17th century, in the 1600s, Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Medina comes along and says this thing is a forgery. And then he gives an example of a similar type of forgery. And I want to read that passage. It's from page 20 of your book in 1986, your edition of Sepher Ha-Yashar and your detailed study. And you quote there from Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Medina from Arinohem, where he says, the forgery of the Zohar, he says, it's like Sepher Ha-Yashar, which they printed contrary to my opinion and the opinion of the rabbis here in Venice about 20 years ago. And he says, I removed from it the delusionary inscription. I love that phrase. That this was the Sepher Ha-Yashar mentioned in scripture. And still there are people who claim it was found after the destruction of the temple. So this is Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Medina. He says, yeah, the Zohar is a forgery, just like Sepher Ha-Yashar. And your point is, nobody took Sepher Ha-Yashar seriously, but they did take the Zohar seriously. And that's why he brings this analogy. Now, what's really, really cool is what you mentioned in a footnote. And I went and dug this up yesterday at the Jewish National Library at Givat Ram. You mentioned in the footnote that there is one copy in the world of the original printing of Sepher Ha-Yashar from 1625 before Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Modena censored it. And I went to see it with my own two eyes, and I saw it. And this is, and I'm going to post it on the website, nehemiaswall.com. It's the original title page, which in Hebrew says, it introduces it. It says, the Book of Yashar, an ancient book written in ancient times, which includes many stories not mentioned in the legends of our sages. And perhaps this is the Book of Yashar mentioned in scripture. Perhaps. So he's still careful, but he makes a pretty big claim. He says these aren't stories taken from the legends of the sages, from the Midrash. So the more common edition after this, which is there's many copies after the censorship in 1625, and these are both from 1625. It has a very different introduction. In the later 1625 title page, it says the Book of Yashar, which includes some stories and legends of our sages. Completely different. In other words, these are midrashim. These are the type of stories our sages tell. This isn't the original Book of Yashar, even though the actual body of the second introduction claims that it is, which you say is, the author in the 16th century. So now in 1839, there was a man named M.M. Noah who published the Sepher Ha-Yashar in New York. Or he published it in 1840. In 1839, he writes, he says, I have no hesitation in pronouncing it a work of great antiquity and interest. And I want to jump into some of the reasons you say this isn't the original Book of Yashar. I mean, they're not the one mentioned in the Bible. And you mentioned some of these to me when we met a week ago. You gave me like some really powerful proofs. Share with me some of those and we'll talk about them.
Just briefly, and I think my emotional connection with Sepher Ha-Yashar.
Your emotional connection.
Yeah. The one thing I like about it is this legend of Tzfo ben Eliphaz.
Okay. Now, Tzfo ben Eliphaz, in English, I think they say Zipho.
Zipho.
Okay. So Tzfo is the grandson of Esau, of Esav.
Right.
Great-grandson of Isaac.
Once in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's a biblical figure. And the Sepher Ha-Yashar dedicates dozens of pages to detailed narrative of the events of and the history of this Tzfo ben Eliphaz, things which, as far as I know, and I'm quite sure, are not to be found anywhere else. So it's most probably a pure fabrication, a pure fiction written by this author. And the point is that this story of Tzfo ben Eliphaz, as presented in Sepher Ha-Yashar, is quite similar in quite a few details to the epic of the history of Rome, written by Virgil, the Aeneas story and so on, which the author undoubtedly knew, the author of Sepher Ha-Yashar undoubtedly knew, and copied it, and copied some of the details. And I think here he had an interest to explain what is the connection between Esau, who is actually the brother of Jacob, yeah?
Yeah.
How Jewish can you get?
Yeah.
And Rome, which is referred to in Jewish history as Esav, Edom
Right.
or Esav.
Yeah.
So this narrative claims that this Tzfor ben Eliphaz, the grandson of Esau, he is the actual founder of the kingdom of Rome, yeah? And this is why the Romans are the sons, can be referred to as descendants of Esau, yeah? And this is why they are called Edom, as the Bible refers to Esau, because he lived in Har Seir in Edom. And so here he tried to bring together Jewish biblical history and Roman history, and I think he did it very nicely.
Meaning as a fiction.
As a fiction.
And just, I just want to reiterate what you said before, which is that he had no other way of expressing fiction except to pretend what's called pseudepigrapha.
Yeah.
In other words, he had to pretend he was some other author, or there just wasn't another way of writing in this period of Jewish history.
There was no rubric, there was no place,
to write
no
a novel.
corner in Jewish culture for works of fiction.
That's actually really interesting, because today you go into a bookstore and you have the section which is fiction. And you're saying that section didn't exist in the Jewish bookstore in the 1500s, and so he had to pretend he was somebody else.
Like many others.
Okay.
I wrote many years ago a book on medieval Jewish stories, the narratives in the Middle Ages, and I gave quite a few examples of apologies, of people writing narratives and apologizing for doing so. Yeah, the fact that you want to tell a story, or that some people like to read a story, that's within Jewish framework, is no reason to do it, except for a very brief period, by the way, a brief period at the center of which is the Zohar.
Interesting. That's very interesting. Wow.
The author of the Zohar was even a friend, we know, of some of the writers.
So he could have
Makkamas.
written it as a fiction, the author of the Zohar, but he chose not to.
If someone puts forward the claim that the author himself did not believe for a moment that he's writing history,
Yeah.
but that he knew that he was writing fiction, I think it's
possible.
And the people around him,
Yeah.
in the first generation after the Zohar, they all treated it as a fiction.
I have a great story I want to share about that, Professor Dan. There's this great story that Elie Wiesel tells. Elie Wiesel is, the great author of You have met him, okay. So he's written many, many books on the Holocaust as fiction. And so there's a story he tells that he once met his childhood rabbi, and the rabbi asked him, "What do you do?" And the rabbi didn't know what fiction was. So he tries to explain to him. And so the rabbi says, "So you tell lies." And Elie Wiesel's response...
In English fiction, it's actually
That's true. And so Elie Wiesel's response, and I don't know the exact quote here, but he says something to the effect of, he says, "Well, not everything that ever happened is true, and many things that are true never happened." And he's trying to explain to the rabbi, it's profound, it's deeply profound, but he's trying to explain to a rabbi whose mindset is still in the Middle Ages, who doesn't know what fiction is. He's trying to explain to him, I don't tell lies. I'm telling deep, profound truths through things that never necessarily happened. And I get the impression when I read in, the Talmud stories about, all kinds of things of angels and voices from heaven. And you wonder, did the rabbis who wrote this think this happened, or are they trying to express a moral story, a moral principle?
Whatever they did, sometimes we'll never know.
Right.
Yeah. But what we do know is that the interpreters of the Talmud in the next many centuries try to explain all these stories as fact, not fiction.
They took them literally as fact.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe in the Bible itself, I don't know. Maybe there are parts which were written as fiction, became very sacred, and everybody takes them as fact and not
so
fiction.
The example of that, even within the Jewish tradition, is there were rabbis who said that the book of Job was written as a mashal, as a parable, and not that there was a man in Utz named
But they
named
say
Job.
mashal Because
As a parable, yeah.
because they didn't have a term for fiction.
Okay. Well, or it was a story to express a deeper spiritual principle.
The fiction can do that.
Okay.
Fiction is not,
Yeah.
it's not contradicting
Okay.
a message or spiritual
And I happen to think
message.
it's not a mashal, but definitely there are people who, even within the Jewish tradition, who explain that about the Book of Job,
because
for example.
people are people.
Yeah. Okay.
And then come
Yeah.
the conventions
Yeah.
of culture
Yeah.
that they try to fit in.
And I think it was Nachmanides Ramban who famously said about the Jewish legends, the Agadav, the Midrash, that anybody who denies all of them is a heretic, but anybody who believes all of them is insane. Something like that. But you're saying in the first generation, they definitely took it literally. So I want to go into some of these details of Sepher Ha-Yashar, and we'll try to do this briefly. So, as I was reading this, I was trying to give it the benefit of the doubt and say, look, maybe this is from the period of Joshua. And unless I see evidence to the contrary, I'm going to take that as, and I actually asked you, so you gave me the example, let's go back to this. You gave me the example of Virgil's Aeneid, which we know was written between 29 and 19 BC in Rome. It was an epic poem written by the poet Virgil. He's giving basically an alternative history of Rome. The standard history of Rome was the story of Romulus and Remus. And so he gives an alternative story that there is this survivor from Troy during the, Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey about the wars of Troy, and that there was a survivor from Troy named Aeneas who had all these adventures and eventually arrives in Rome. And he settles in Rome, and he's the real founder of Rome. And that story is basically told here, but instead of Aeneas, we have Zepho, the grandson of Esau. Although it's a little bit more complicated, there's all kinds of things going on. But that one thing in itself proves the fact that one of his sources is clearly the Aeneid of Virgil, that it can't be from the time of Joshua. I mean, that's kind of the end of the story right there.
And as you mentioned before, the terms Africa, and the name of Hannibal.
So what are some other things? One of the statements you made to me, I said, what about the language? Could it be biblical Hebrew? And you made the remark to me, you said, read any two sentences and you'll see it's not biblical Hebrew.
Except in the beginning.
So it kind of pretends to be biblical Hebrew.
It pretends to be biblical, then he gets tired of it. And
he doesn't really pull it off. And so, for example, he'll have words that don't exist in biblical Hebrew, but he kind of has this pseudo-biblical Hebrew, as you said, until he gets tired and he stops trying to pull it off. And are there any other things that you want to share? About this book.
About the language. Please remember that there was no spoken Hebrew at that time.
Meaning this is the 16th century in Naples.
Yeah. So
what was Hebrew at that time?
Easily adapt Talmudic language, halachic language, biblical language, and it will not contradict anything, There was no real alternative.
So he might not have been sensitive enough to what we would, analytically say is biblical Hebrew to say, I can't use that word. That's not a word from the period of Joshua. You're saying so who was writing and reading Hebrew in the 16th century? And that's actually one of your fields of expertise.
This period is one of the greatest and flourishing of Hebrew culture in Italy. That's immediately after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And many of the intellectuals from Spain made their home in Italy. And there was a long tradition of Jewish culture in Italy. And the 16th century is really, for us also, it's a renaissance. Not in the European sense, but it's a great seething and profound culture.
So you had Jews who could read Hebrew, who wrote Hebrew, and it was a major vehicle for
hundreds.
And that's kind of important because a lot of times people will hear Hebrew was a dead language and it was brought back to life by Eliezer ben Yehuda, but it wasn't a dead language in the sense that maybe Akkadian was, meaning people always read and wrote in Hebrew, right?
No doubt.
Okay. That's something that people miss when they hear it was a dead language. It wasn't completely dead. It was a language of writing, of literature.
In this sense, it was more alive. Look, I'm dealing with the Kabbalah. We have, from this period, we have several thousands of works. Thousands.
Wow.
So, and halacha, Jewish law, and homilies, There are many, many thousands.
Wow. Written in Hebrew. Wow.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually kind of one of the things that, if I'm not mistaken, that Professor Gershom Scholem, that he discovered. In other words, before him, people didn't take studying the Kabbalah seriously.
That's right.
So I heard the criticism was that people said to him, you can't study Kabbalah, it's shtut. And he famously, I don't know if he said this, but he's attributed to have said, he said, shtut ze shtut, aval cheker ha-shtut ze mada. He didn't say that. Okay.
No, it's the exact opposite.
Oh, what did he say?
No, I don't think he will contradict it.
Okay.
But this is what by the greatest Talmudic scholar of the 20th century and the great occasional friend of Gershom Scholem, Shaul Lieberman. He introduced Scholem in a lecture in New York saying, we know that Kabbalah is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is a science. Yeah.
That's great. That's beautiful. And that's actually really profound.
Legends say it's true.
It's very profound because before Gershom Scholem, people said, yeah, Kabbalah, that's not serious. And what he discovered is Kabbalah evolved over time. It changed over time. There were thousands of different books with different opinions and perspectives. And that's what you're continuing in his footsteps. And it's actually really profound. Thank you so much, Professor Dan.
You're
I really
welcome.
appreciate it. This is, I have to say, Professor Dan, I've done many, many interviews, and I'm deeply honored to have been able to sit here and speak with someone who won the Israel Prize. I really feel that I'm in the presence of greatness here, and I'm not exaggerating. You know, you're a very humble man, but you really are one of the top people in all time in Jewish studies, and in the study of Kabbalah, which we didn't even really talk about. You are today the world's greatest scholar. Now, Professor Dan, I noticed that I forgot to tell people this. You have a list of publications that came out in 2012. And this is just the list of books and articles that you published. And just the list is 207 pages long. And one of the things you said to me when we first met about a week ago is you said, don't come back until you've looked through this. And I did. And one of the books that you wrote here in your list, I'm really excited about. And it's a book about Jewish messianism, about Jewish expectations of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. Yeah. And you wrote this book in Hebrew, so there's no way most of my audience will ever have access to this information. Professor Dan, I would love, after I've had a chance to study that book, to come back and do an interview with you about Jewish messianism and expectations of the Mashiach. Would you be willing to do that?
This book is dedicated to the modern period.
The modern period.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful.
Not
I think
classical.
No, I understand. And the modern period, you begin in which century, Professor Dan?
15th, 16th.
Okay. In the 15th, 16th century, that's the modern period. So that would be amazing to sit with you and talk. What was it that Jews expected of a Messiah? And I have to tell you, in my own experience, that's something that I saw changes to this in my lifetime. In the 1980s, with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, in my lifetime, I remember some of these changes. And you can trace this back to the 15th century. I would love to sit and talk with you about that. And God willing, that will be the follow-up interview in the future. All right. Would you come back and talk with us about that, Professor Dan?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Guys, I hope you're looking forward to that because I'm excited about it. All right. Shalom.
Shalom.
What an amazing conversation. And we barely scratched the surface. Professor Dan clearly believes that the Book of Jasher was written in Naples in the early 1500s, not in the time of Joshua. But we really didn't get into too many details with actual evidence from the book. We just didn't have time. So I decided to do a follow-up study with concrete examples and definitive proof. If you enjoyed the discussion with Professor Dan, you will absolutely love the follow-up study, my raw stream of Torah consciousness on the Book of Jasher. Check it out on nehemiaswall.com. Shalom.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.